The forests of the Appalachian foothills in Pennsylvania are a world woven from deep greens and stony grays. A place where ancient oaks and hemlocks stand in a silent, unending council. The air is the language here, a crisp, clean breath that carries the scent of damp earth and pine, turning the world into a living cathedral of shadow and light. It was here, in a sliver of wilderness carved between rolling hills, that Jack Callahan came to erase himself. He'd chosen this place not for its quiet beauty, but for its profound indifference. The old-growth trees didn't care about the ghosts that walked beside him, and the rustle of wind through the canopy was the only sound vast enough to drown out the ringing in his ears. His home was a small, functional cabin of dark timber set back from an old logging trail, a solitary outpost against the wild. Jack Callahan was a man made of sharp edges and a coiled tension that hummed even in stillness. He was a Navy SEAL on extended leave, though the term leave felt like a lie. It was an exile. His face, framed by short, dark hair, was a map of hard miles, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been put there by smiling. His eyes, a deep, guarded brown, held the calm, watchful look of a predator, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from a deep and abiding familiarity with violence. He moved with an unsettling economy of motion, a silent efficiency that made him seem like a shadow, even in broad daylight. He was trying to forget how to be a weapon and remember how to be a man. And so far, he was failing. His only companion in this self-imposed isolation was Rocco. A magnificent German shepherd, Rocco was more than a dog. He was an anchor. His coat was a classic black and tan, his ears perpetually alert, his intelligent amber eyes missing nothing. Rocco was a creature of immense discipline and unspoken understanding, a partner who had served alongside Jack in places that now existed only as classified files and recurring nightmares. He didn't need words. A subtle shift in Jack's posture, a tightening in his jaw, was all Rocco needed to know. The dog was his early warning system, his therapist, and the only living thing whose presence didn't feel like an intrusion. He was Jack's six, even here, thousands of miles from any war zone. Their days fell into a Spartan rhythm. Up before dawn, a brutal workout that left Jack's muscles screaming, a welcome pain that drowned out the unwelcome memories. Then a long patrol along the forested ridges, regardless of the weather. It was on one such afternoon, with a cool autumn haze hanging in the air and the forest floor a carpet of fallen leaves, that the rhythm was broken. They were heading east, the packed earth of a deer trail firm under Jack's boots, the air thick with the smell of pine and decay. Rocco was trotting a few paces ahead, his gait relaxed and confident, a dark shape against the deep green of the undergrowth. Jack was lost in the hypnotic whisper of the wind, a numb state of mindfulness he actively pursued when Rocco suddenly froze. His entire body went rigid. His head snapped to the right, ears swiveling like radar dishes, locked with intense focus on a thicket of rhododendron bordering the trail. A low growl started, a deep vibration in his chest. It wasn't a sound of aggression. It was an alert, an alarm. Jack stopped instantly, his senses flaring, the fog in his mind vaporized. He scanned the tree line, his eyes trained to see what others missed, searching for any sign of movement, any anomaly. He saw nothing but the damp, green shadows of the forest, the tangled branches, the dark, towering trunks. Nothing. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, his voice low and steady. "What is it?" Rocco didn't relax. He took a hesitant step toward the woods, then another, his nose twitching, decoding a story from the air that Jack couldn't see. He whined, a sound of profound unease, and looked back at Jack, his amber eyes wide and urgent. This is what set every nerve in Jack's body on high alert. Rocco was trained to be steady in the face of direct threats. He'd held his ground in firefights, stayed silent during covert entries. This behavior, this anxious, insistent agitation was different. It wasn't about a threat. It was about something being wrong. Deeply wrong. Jack trusted Rocco's instincts more than his own. Rocco's senses were cleaner, unclouded by memory or trauma. "Show me," Jack said, the single, quiet command all that was needed. Rocco didn't hesitate. He broke from his stillness and plunged into the undergrowth, not recklessly, but with a determined purpose, pushing through the thick, damp ferns that marked the forest's edge. Jack followed without a flicker of hesitation, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the large survival knife on his belt. The transition from the open trail to the deep woods was immediate. The world became a close, enclosed space. The sound of the wind faded, replaced by a strange, dripping quiet. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. Sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, leaving the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. Rocco moved with a certainty that defied the lack of any visible path. He navigated the maze of fallen logs and tangled roots, moving deeper into the woods, up a steady incline. Jack moved behind him, his footsteps silent, his body gliding through the environment with the practiced grace of a man who'd spent his life moving through hostile territories. He was no longer just a man on a walk. He was an operator. His senses were fully engaged, cataloging the snap of every twig, the scent of the air, the subtle changes in terrain. He felt the familiar cold trickle of adrenaline begin to seep into his veins. It was a feeling he hated and one he knew better than any other. For what felt like an hour, they continued their ascent. The woods grew denser, wilder. This was ancient land, a place untouched by trails. Jack knew they had to be miles from his cabin in a direction he'd never explored. Twice Rocco paused, lifting his nose to the air as if tasting the wind before making a slight course correction and pressing on. He was tracking something. Not a scent trail on the ground, but something carried on the heavy, damp air. A distress signal, Jack guessed, that only an animal of Rocco's caliber could perceive. The silence of the forest was absolute, profound. No birdsong, no chattering squirrels. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Just as a sliver of doubt began to creep into Jack's mind, just as he started to wonder if Rocco was on a wild goose chase, the dog slowed. He began to move more cautiously, his body low to the ground. Up ahead, through the dense lattice of trees, Jack saw it. A glint of something that didn't belong. It wasn't the natural shape of a tree or a rock. It was a straight line, a man-made structure. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into the roofline of a small cabin, tucked so perfectly into a fold of the land and backed against a sheer rock face that it was almost perfectly camouflaged. It was old, weathered, but clearly maintained. A thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke curled from its stone chimney, a fragile sign of life in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Rocco stopped at the edge of the clearing, letting out a single, soft bark. It wasn't a challenge. It was an announcement. "We're here." Jack moved past him, his eyes locked on the cabin door, his mind racing. People who lived this deep in the woods, this far off any known map, were either hiding from the world or hiding from someone. And a cold, hard knot in his gut told him that whatever was inside that cabin was the source of the deep and terrible wrongness his dog had sensed from miles away. He had come to this place to find peace, but the soldier in him knew with absolute certainty that he had just found a war. Jack approached the cabin with the ingrained caution of a man who knows that doors can hide threats as well as shelter. He moved in a low crouch, using the trunk of a fallen hemlock for cover, while Rocco crept silently beside him, a dark shadow pressed to the forest floor. From this new vantage point, Jack could see the details. The cabin was well built, the logs expertly notched, the roof a mix of moss and cedar shakes that made it blend seamlessly into the hillside. It was a place built not to be seen. There were no windows on the side facing him. A deliberate, defensive choice. Whoever was inside knew how to think about security. His instincts screamed that this was no simple hermit's dwelling. He listened. The wind sighed through the high pine branches, and the steady drip of water echoed from a nearby rock face. Beneath those sounds, he heard it. A faint, dry cough followed by a weak, stifled moan. It was the sound of genuine suffering. It changed the entire dynamic of the situation. This wasn't a potential ambush. It was an infirmary. Rocco whined softly, a low note of confirmation. Jack made his decision. He moved from behind the log, his steps deliberate and silent on the damp earth, stopping a few feet from the cabin's single, heavy plank door. He didn't knock. Years of training had taught him that announcing your presence on a stranger's doorstep was a courtesy you couldn't always afford. Before he could decide on his next move, a voice filtered through the wood, thin and reedy, almost a whisper. "Please, is someone there? Please." The voice was a woman's, strained with a desperation that cut through Jack's professional detachment. He pushed the door. It swung inward on creaking leather hinges, revealing a room steeped in shadow and the smell of wood smoke and sickness. The interior was Spartan, lit only by the weak flames in a small stone fireplace and the gray light filtering through a single, grime-streaked window on the far side of the room. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. In the corner, lying on a simple cot of stretched canvas and wood, was a woman. Her face was pale and slick with sweat in the firelight, her dark hair tangled on a thin pillow. This was Clara Evans. Even in her weakened state, there was an unmistakable strength in the set of her jaw and the fiercely intelligent light in her eyes as they locked onto him. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, but exhaustion and illness had carved years onto her features. From the darkest corner of the room, another figure emerged. A little girl, no more than 5 years old, stepped silently into the dim light. This was Lily. She was small for her age, dressed in practical but worn clothes that hung loosely on her thin frame. Her brown hair was a wild tangle, but it was her eyes that captured Jack's attention. They were huge and dark, and they held the unnervingly solemn gravity of an old soul. She didn't cry or hide. She just stood there, a silent, tiny sentry, her gaze fixed on Jack with an intensity that was both heartbreaking and unnerving. She wasn't just a child. She was a survivor. "The dog," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "You followed the dog." It wasn't a question. Jack gave a short nod, his own voice feeling like a rusted tool in his throat. "He led me here." He stepped into the room, Rocco at his heels, alert but calm. Jack's eyes swept the cabin, his mind automatically taking inventory of their situation. A few empty cans on a makeshift shelf, a bucket of water less than a quarter full. The blankets were clean but thin. These were people at the absolute end of their resources. His gaze returned to Clara, her breathing rapid and shallow, the sheen of sweat, the tremor in her hands. He knew the signs. His training as a SEAL included advanced field medicine. "You have a fever," he stated, his tone flat and professional. "How long?" Clara tried to push herself up, but a wave of dizziness sent her falling back against the pillow. Lily immediately moved to her side, placing a small hand on her mother's arm in a gesture of deeply practiced care. 3 days, Clara gasped. "It won't break." Jack's eyes settled on a small, high-quality backpack tucked under the cot. It was a child's pack made of modern, durable nylon with a small star embroidered on the front. It looked completely out of place in the rustic, hand-built cabin, a relic from another world. Beside it, half covered by a blanket, was a sleek black rectangle, a satellite phone, its screen dark and lifeless. It was an expensive piece of tech. This small detail confirmed his suspicion. These were not wilderness people. They were refugees from a world of wealth and convenience, now stranded. "I need to get fluids into you," Jack said, his mind shifting from assessment to action. "I have supplies at my cabin. It's a few hours from here." Clara's eyes, bright with fever, filled with a fresh terror. "We can't leave," she whispered urgently. "He'll find us." "He?" Jack asked, keeping his tone even. Clara's gaze flickered to Lily, a silent communication passing between them. The child's expression remained unchanged. A small, stoic mask. "He's looking for her," she said, her energy fading fast. "He has people everywhere." Her words were vague, but the terror behind them was real and palpable. She wasn't just sick, she was hunted, and the little girl beside her was the prize. Jack felt the familiar pull of a world he had tried so hard to leave behind, a world of predators and prey, of missions and objectives. He had wanted peace, a quiet war against his own demons. But a new war had just found him. He looked at the child, Lily, who was now using a damp cloth to cool Clara's forehead with a heartbreakingly proficient efficiency. He saw in her eyes a reflection of the same desperate hope he himself had once felt. The hope that someone, anyone, would care enough to stay and fight. His decision was made before he was even conscious of it. "I'm not leaving you," he said. The words came out with a certainty that surprised him. "I'm going for my gear. I'll be back before dark." Clara's eyes searched his face, looking for a sign of deception, a hint of weakness. What she found was the unshakable resolve of a man who had made a promise and would die before he broke it. She gave a faint, exhausted nod, her body finally surrendering to the fever and an overwhelming sense of relief. Her eyes closed. Jack looked at Lily. She met his gaze directly, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than wary fear entered her expression. It was the faintest, most hesitant glimmer of trust. "I'm Jack," he said softly. "This is Rocco." The little girl said nothing, but she gave a single, tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. Jack turned to leave, Rocco at his side. He had a mission now. Get supplies. Fortify this position, keep them alive. As he stepped back out into the gray, damp wilderness, he knew his quiet life at the edge of the world was officially over. He now had a new objective, to stand between this sanctuary and the monsters trying to tear it down. The journey back through the forest was a different kind of exercise. Before, Jack had been an explorer, following Rocco's instincts into the unknown. Now he was an operator on a clock. The sun was beginning its slow descent, and the forest canopy was already stealing the light, plunging the undergrowth into a deep, emerald twilight. Every step was measured, every glance calculated. His mind, which he had so carefully tried to keep empty, was now a whirring machine of tactical assessments. He wasn't just walking. He was memorizing the route, marking landmarks, a lightning-scarred hemlock, a particularly mossy boulder, a creek that cut a sharp, deep line through the terrain. He noted potential ambush points and concealed observation posts. His solitude had been breached, and this wilderness was no longer a refuge. It was an area of operations. Rocco seemed to understand the shift in urgency. The dog moved with a new, focused intensity, staying close to Jack's side, his head constantly, silently swiveling. He was no longer just a companion. He was a sentry, his senses an extension of Jack's own, a living piece of his situational awareness. They moved with the fluid, synchronized grace of a team that had navigated places far more dangerous than this. The 2-hour trek felt like 20 minutes. When his own cabin finally came into view, a solid dark shape against the graying sky, Jack felt a pang of something he couldn't name. It was the last outpost of his isolation, and he was about to plunder it for a war he never wanted. Inside, the cabin was a testament to his disciplined existence. A single cot with a neatly folded wool blanket, a small table with one chair. His belongings were stowed in military-grade footlockers, everything clean, organized, and ready. There were no pictures on the walls, no personal trinkets, nothing to suggest a life beyond this Spartan existence. It was the bivouac of a man who knew how to pack light and leave no trace. He went straight to the largest trunk and unfastened the heavy steel latches. The top layer was what anyone would expect: spare clothes, tools, rope. But beneath that was the equipment he had hoped never to unpack again. He pulled out a comprehensive trauma kit, its contents going far beyond a standard first aid set. He laid out saline 4 bags, sterile suture kits, pressure dressings, and most importantly, a couple of vials of broad-spectrum antibiotics he kept for emergencies. He added a handful of high-calorie, military-grade ration bars, a water filter, a small cooking pot, and a powerful LED flashlight with spare batteries. Then he paused, his hand hovering over the bottom of the trunk. He reached in and lifted out a heavy, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. Unrolling it revealed a Sig Sauer P226, his old service pistol, and 3 full magazines. He checked the action with a smooth, practiced motion. It was clean, oiled, and ready. He wasn't just bringing medicine and food. He was bringing a fight. At the very bottom of the chest was a small, locked metal box. He opened it with a key he wore on a chain around his neck. Inside were no weapons, only 2 items. One was a perfectly folded American flag, the kind given to the families of fallen soldiers. The other was a photograph. It showed 5 young men in combat gear, their faces smeared with sweat and dirt, but grinning broadly at the camera. They were crowded together, arms slung over each other's shoulders. Jack was in the center, looking younger, his eyes brighter. His finger traced over the face of the man next to him, a man with a wide, easy smile and laughing eyes. This was Mike Ghost Riley, his best friend, his swim buddy, the man who had died on their last mission, the mission that had sent Jack fleeing to this forgotten corner of the world. A ghost with a brilliant smile. He stared at the photo, at the easy brotherhood captured in that single moment, and the familiar, cold wave of grief and failure washed over him. He had promised Mike's family, promised himself, that he would look out for his team. And he had failed. The thought was a physical weight, a pressure in his chest that never fully went away. He was choosing to engage again, to make himself responsible for someone else's safety. The damaged, logical part of his brain screamed that this was a mistake. That attachment was a liability. That caring was a direct path to the kind of pain he'd spent the last year trying to outrun. He had failed his brother. What made him think he could succeed in protecting these strangers? But then he saw Lily's face in his mind. Her small, serious expression. Her old, watchful eyes that held no tears, only a grim understanding of the world. She wasn't asking for a hero. She was just a kid trying to protect her mother, trying to hold on in a world that had clearly given her nothing but reasons to let go. He wasn't Mike, and Lily wasn't his team. But the mission felt the same. Stand in the breach. Hold the line. Protect the innocent. It was the core code that had been hammered into him, the very essence of being a SEAL. Maybe he couldn't fix the past. Maybe he couldn't bring Mike back, but he could choose not to walk away from this. He could choose to honor his friend's memory by fighting a battle that needed to be fought. He slammed the box shut, his decision hardening into a cold resolve. He packed the supplies into a durable backpack, shrugged it on, and clipped the holstered pistol to his belt, concealing it under his jacket. He was no longer just Jack Callahan, the recluse. He was a guardian, equipped and armed for a mission. He looked at the cabin one last time, a silent goodbye to the quiet refuge it had been. Then he turned to his partner. "Let's go, Rocco," he said, his voice hard. "Time to go to work." The return journey was faster, fueled by adrenaline and purpose. Darkness had fallen completely, and the forest was a labyrinth of black trunks and deeper shadows. The air had turned cold, carrying the damp chill of the coming night. Jack used the flashlight's powerful beam to cut through the gloom, but he relied more on his memory and Rocco's senses. They were a single, efficient unit moving through a hostile world. When they finally reached the edge of the clearing, Jack killed the light. The cabin was a faint, warm orange rectangle in the oppressive dark, a single light against the wilderness. He looked at it not as a stranger's home, but as his post, a position he had to hold. He felt the weight of his promise to return, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a purpose. Jack pushed the door open and stepped back into the underlit cabin, bringing the cold, clean scent of the night forest with him. Rocco patted in at his heels and immediately lay down by the hearth, a quiet, reassuring presence. The small room was just as he'd left it. Lily was sitting on a small wooden stool near the cot, her back straight, a tiny sentinel holding her post. She watched him, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering firelight, but she didn't flinch as he approached. In the corner, Clara was stirring, her breathing still shallow and ragged. The fire had burned low, and a deep chill was beginning to seep through the log walls. Without a word, Jack dropped his pack and got to work. His movements were swift and economical, the practiced efficiency of a man running on muscle memory. He added logs to the fire, coaxing the dying embers back into a steady, warm flame. Then he turned his attention to Clara. Lily watched his every move as he unpacked the medical kit, her gaze sharp and analytical. Jack was aware of her scrutiny, but he didn't acknowledge it directly. He knew that for a child like her, actions were the only currency that mattered. He sterilized a needle and expertly found a vein in Clara's arm, taping the fourth line securely. Soon, a steady drip of saline solution began to flow into her system, a lifeline of hydration and electrolytes. He crushed a powerful antibiotic tablet, mixed it with a little clean water from his canteen, and gently helped her drink the bitter concoction. Throughout, he spoke in a low, calm murmur, not to her, but for her. This will help with the dehydration. The medicine will start fighting the infection. He wasn't asking for a response. He was providing information, creating an atmosphere of control and competence in a situation that had neither. He worked with a detached focus, the same focus he would apply to cleaning a weapon or planning a route. It was his armor, a wall of professionalism that kept the chaos at bay. Once Clara was stable and resting more comfortably, the steady drip of the fourth a quiet metronome in the room, Jack turned his attention to the child. He took a ration bar from his pack and held it out to her. "You need to eat," he said, his voice softer than before. Lily looked from the bar to his face, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she didn't move. Jack didn't push. He just held it there, a simple, unconditional offering. Finally, her small hand reached out and took it. Her fingers were ice cold. She unwrapped it slowly, deliberately, and took a small bite, her eyes never leaving his. An hour passed in near silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the deepening breaths of Clara, and the distant sigh of the wind. Rocco had shifted, moving from the hearth to lie on the floor near Lily's stool, his great head resting on his paws, a furry, steadfast guardian. The antibiotics and hydration worked faster than Jack had hoped. The violent shivers that had racked Clara's body had subsided, and the feverish flush in her cheeks was beginning to recede. She stirred and opened her eyes. This time they were clear. The frantic, fevered light was gone, replaced by a deep, weary lucidity. She looked at the fourth in her arm, then at Jack, who was sitting quietly on the cabin's lone chair, sharpening his knife with a whetstone. "Thank you," she said, her voice still weak but steady. Jack nodded, not pausing the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel. "You need to rest." "I need to tell you what you've walked into," she countered, pushing herself up slightly on her elbows. "You have a right to know who's hunting us." Jack stopped his work and gave her his full attention. "His name," she said, and the name dropped like a stone into the quiet room, "is Harrison Vance." She paused as if expecting the name to mean something to him, but Jack's face remained a blank mask. He had been disconnected from the world of news and headlines for a long time. Clara continued, her voice low and intense. "He's based out of Philadelphia, a tech billionaire. Founded a company called Omni Data Solutions. He's one of the most powerful men on the East Coast. And he's Lily's grandfather." She described him not as a monster of overt physical violence, but as something far more chilling. Harrison Vance was a man of quiet, meticulous control. He was in his late 60s with a neatly trimmed silver beard and cold, calculating blue eyes. He was a public philanthropist and a private tyrant. A man who saw the world and everyone in it as a series of assets and liabilities. "Lily's parents died in a car crash last year," Clara explained. "They left everything to Lily in a trust she controls when she turns 21. Vance was named her legal guardian. He doesn't love her. He loves her inheritance. He sees her as a key to a vault he can't otherwise open. Jack listened, the pieces clicking into place, the expensive gear, the desperate flight. This wasn't a family dispute. It was a corporate takeover using a child as the prize. I was his executive assistant, Clara said, a trace of bitterness in her voice. I saw what he was doing to her, the control, the isolation. He was conditioning her, trying to break her spirit so she'd be pliable. When I found evidence he was having her medicated to keep her docile, I knew I had to get her out. This explained the child's silence, her unnatural stillness. It wasn't just shyness. It was a symptom of trauma. He won't stop, Clara whispered, her eyes finding Lily in the dim light. To him, this isn't about family. It's about a loose asset, a security breach. He'll find us. He has unlimited resources, private security, investigators, people who are paid to make problems disappear. Jack thought of the pistol now tucked in the small of his back. It suddenly felt very small. There's one more thing, Clara said, her voice dropping even lower. I didn't leave empty-handed, she gestured toward the child's backpack. Before I left, I copied the files from his private server. Everything. Illegal market manipulation, corporate espionage, blackmailing politicians. It's all on a multi-encrypted drive in that pack. I thought it would be my leverage, my life insurance. But now I think it just makes us a bigger liability, a loose end he has to eliminate at any cost. The full weight of it settled on Jack. This wasn't just a rescue. He had stumbled into a war against a man who commanded a private army and had the power to erase people. His promise to a sick woman in a dark cabin had made him the direct enemy of a modern-day king. Clara, exhausted by the confession, sank back onto the pillow, her eyes closing as a deep, healing sleep finally claimed her. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Lily had finished her ration bar and had curled up on the floor, her small body nestled against Rocco's warm flank, finally allowing herself a moment of rest. Jack sat in the silence, the rhythmic drip of the fourth counting off the seconds. He looked at the sleeping child, an innocent caught in a vicious game, and he understood that he hadn't just found a mission. He had found something he hadn't had in years, a fight worth fighting. The deepest hour of the night, the one just before the dawn, was Jack's watch. He sat on the single wooden chair, the loaded pistol on the table beside him, a cold, heavy weight in the firelight. Clara was in a deep, healing sleep on the cot, her fever finally broken, her breathing slow and even. By the hearth, Lily slept soundly for what was probably the first time in weeks. Her small body was curled against Rocco's side, one hand tangled in the dog's thick fur. The quiet in the cabin was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of glass that Jack knew could shatter at any moment. He used the silence not to rest, but to plan. He had mentally walked the perimeter of the small clearing a dozen times, mapping every tree, every boulder, every shadow. He identified 2 viable escape routes, countless blind spots, and the most likely avenue of approach. His mind, honed by years of mission planning, was building a defense out of nothing but terrain and desperation. The first warning came, as he knew it would, from Rocco. The dog's head came up off his paws, a movement so slight Jack would have missed it if he hadn't been watching. A low rumble, too deep for the human ear to register as anything but a vibration, started in the dog's chest. His ears, which had been relaxed in sleep, were now erect, locked on a single point in the darkness outside, far to the east. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed a compact, high-powered monocular from his pack and moved to the single, grimy window, peering through a small section he had wiped clean. He saw nothing but the pre-dawn blackness, a world of indistinct shapes and deep shadows. But Rocco was insistent. The dog rose in a single fluid motion, a silent shadow detaching from the floor and moving to the door, his body low and tense. Jack trusted the dog. He kept the monocular trained on the area where Rocco was focused, a ridge some 400 yards away. For 5 minutes, there was nothing. Then he saw it. A flicker of movement, a shape detaching itself from a tree trunk. Then another, and another. 3 figures, moving through the woods with a fluid, disciplined confidence that made the hair on Jack's neck stand up. They were perfectly spaced, moving from cover to cover, their silhouettes lean and sharp. Even at this distance, he could make out the shape of rifles held at a low ready and the faint glint of night vision optics. They weren't trackers. They were hunters. A professional fire team. Vance hadn't sent thugs. He'd sent operators. A cold, familiar calm settled over Jack. The time for planning was over. It was time to execute. He crossed the room in 2 silent strides and gently shook Clara's shoulder. Her eyes shot open, instantly alert, the ingrained fear of the hunted overriding the exhaustion of sickness. "They're here," Jack said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. 3 of them, approaching from the east. "They're pros." He saw the terror flash in her eyes, but she swallowed it down, her jaw tightening. "Lily," she breathed. "Get her," Jack commanded. "Far corner, behind the woodpile, it's the most solid part of the cabin. Stay down and stay quiet no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, her eyes wide but determined. She slid from the cot and scooped up her sleeping daughter, carrying her to the designated corner and soothing her gently as she began to stir. Jack moved to the door, pressing his ear against the rough-hewn wood, Rocco a statue of tense muscle at his side. He could hear them now, the faint, almost imperceptible sounds of men moving into position. The soft crunch of leaves, the whisper of tactical gear. They were surrounding the cabin, establishing a perimeter, a classic siege. They were being slow, methodical, controlling the situation. Then, silence. A heavy, ringing silence that was more terrifying than any sound. It stretched for a full minute. Jack could feel his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in his chest. Finally, a voice cut through the pre-dawn stillness. It was calm, clear, and amplified, likely by a small bullhorn. It was a voice used to giving orders and being obeyed. "Clara Evans, we know you're in there. My name is Keene. We have the cabin surrounded." The speaker, Keene, was a man who wasted no words. He sounded like he was reading from a corporate memo, his tone devoid of emotion. He was tall and lean with close-cropped blonde hair and a face of sharp, efficient angles. He was a man who saw this not as a kidnapping, but as a project, an asset retrieval with a clear set of mission parameters. His 2 men were shadows in the trees, their rifles aimed at the cabin's door and single window. "My employer, Mr. Harrison Vance, has asked us to escort you and the child back to Philadelphia," Keene's voice continued. "As reasonable as a business negotiation. He's very concerned for your well-being. Open the door and this can be resolved peacefully. No one needs to get hurt." In the corner, Clara clutched Lily, her knuckles white. She looked at Jack, her eyes pleading. "The drive," she mouthed silently. "Tell them about the drive." Jack gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. He knew that revealing their only piece of leverage now would be a fatal mistake. It would show weakness and desperation. To men like this, desperation was just blood in the water. He remained silent, letting Keene's offer hang in the cold air. His silence was a strategic move, a way to disrupt their script. They expected pleading or panic. They didn't expect disciplined, tactical silence. "Ms. Evans," Keene's voice came again. A note of impatience crept in. "We are not here to negotiate. We have our orders. The child is to be returned. Your cooperation will make this process easier for everyone. Your lack of cooperation will be noted in my report." The veiled threat was clear. She was an obstacle, and obstacles could be removed. Jack glanced at Lily. She was awake now, her face buried in her mother's shoulder, her body trembling. He saw in that small, huddled form the ghost of every innocent he'd ever been tasked to protect. He thought of Mike. He thought of the promise he'd made to himself. Hold the line. He focused back on the door, his knuckles white as he gripped the pistol. The men outside were a problem with a simple, brutal solution. But a gunfight was a last resort, a bloody, chaotic gamble that put the very people he was protecting in the line of fire. He was outnumbered and outgunned. But he wasn't out of the fight yet. "You have 60 seconds to open this door, Ms. Evans," Keene's voice announced. The false politeness was gone, replaced by the hard edge of cold command. "After that, we will be forced to make entry, and I can no longer guarantee the safety of anyone inside. The countdown begins now." The last word hung in the air, an executioner's sentence. Inside the cabin, the world shrunk to the space of a single heartbeat. Jack looked at the door, then at the 2 terrified people huddled in the corner. 60 seconds. 60 seconds to choose between a surrender that meant a terrible certainty and a fight that offered only a slim, bloody chance of survival. The final seconds of the countdown stretched into an eternity. 60, a number that meant nothing and everything. Jack could feel the tension in the small cabin become a physical presence, a pressure on his chest. He saw the abject terror in Clara's eyes as she shielded her daughter. And in that moment, he knew that waiting for the storm to hit was not an option. A passive defense was a losing game. In a fight, the one who controls the violence, who dictates the point and time of impact, holds the advantage, however slim. He wasn't going to wait for them to breach. He was going to make his own breach. 5. 4. Keene's voice was a dispassionate metronome counting down the end of their lives. Jack turned to Rocco, who was poised like a coiled spring beside him. He gave a sharp hand signal. "Attack on my command." He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. 3, 2. On the count of 1, instead of waiting for the door to be kicked in, Jack kicked it out. He exploded through the doorway into the pre-dawn gloom, pistol up and firing. 2 quick, controlled shots, not at Keen, who was off to the side, but at the operator closest to the door. The roar of the pistol was deafening in the forest clearing. It was a pure, calculated act of chaos designed to shatter their plan and seize the initiative. The operator cried out, stumbling back, his rifle clattering on the rocky ground as the rounds tore through his shoulder. The second operator, positioned near the window, was stunned for a half-second by the sheer audacity of the move. It was the opening Jack needed. "Rocco, now," he commanded. The dog shot out of the cabin like a black and tan missile, a low, savage growl ripping from his throat. He ignored the wounded man and launched himself at the second operator, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's thigh. The operator yelled, a mixture of pain and surprise, trying to bring his rifle to bear on the whirlwind of fur and teeth savaging his leg. Jack used the precious seconds Rocco had bought him. He dropped to one knee behind the flimsy cover of the doorframe and engaged Keen, who had recovered from the initial shock and was returning fire. Bullets splintered the wood around Jack's head, kicking up dirt at his feet. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and pine. He could hear Lily crying now, a thin, terrified sound from inside the cabin that cut through the adrenaline and noise. He had to end this, and fast. He risked a glance and saw the second operator had finally kicked Rocco free, raising his weapon. Jack shifted his aim and fired 2 more shots. The man went down, but the math was against him. The wounded man was back on his feet, drawing a sidearm. Keen was a professional, using superior fire control to pin Jack down. His shots were methodical and accurate. He was advancing, using the trees for cover, skillfully closing the distance. Jack knew he had seconds before his position was completely overrun. He had to move. He was about to fall back into the cabin when a small, dark object sailed through the air and landed with a soft thud in the middle of the cabin's single room. A stun grenade. "Down!" He roared, diving back inside and throwing himself over Clara and Lily, shielding them with his own body. The world exploded in a silent, searing white flash, followed by a deafening concussion that felt like a physical blow to his skull. His vision swam in a sea of dancing spots. A high-pitched whine screamed in his ears. He was completely disoriented. Through the ringing, he heard the crunch of boots. He tried to bring his pistol up, his muscles screaming in protest, but a heavy boot slammed down on his wrist, sending a shock of pain up his arm. The pistol was kicked from his numb fingers. A dark shape loomed over him. Keen. The man's face was a cold, impassive mask. He placed the muzzle of his rifle against Jack's temple. "The situation is now under control," Keen said, his voice as calm as if he were closing a business deal. The other 2 men, one bleeding from the shoulder, the other limping, moved into the cabin and secured it. Rocco, still dazed from the blast, was subdued with a sharp kick and held down. Moments later, Jack was on his knees in the middle of the room, his hands zip-tied tightly behind his back. The short, violent resistance was over. The hope that had flared so brightly for a few chaotic seconds had been extinguished, leaving only the cold ash of failure. Keen holstered his rifle and turned his attention to Clara, who was huddled with her daughter, her face a mask of utter despair. "That was an unnecessary and foolish display, Ms. Evans," he said, his voice holding no anger, only a mild, professional disappointment. "My instructions were to return you and the child unharmed. My instructions regarding this man," he indicated Jack with a nod, "were less specific. He has now injured 2 of my associates. That makes him a considerable liability." He drew his sidearm, the click of the safety being disengaged echoing in the silent cabin. Jack looked up at him, the ringing in his ears finally starting to fade. He saw the cold, detached look in Keen's eyes. This man would kill him without a flicker of hesitation, not out of malice, but because it was the most efficient way to solve the problem he represented. He looked at Clara, saw her shaking her head in a silent plea. He looked at Lily, her tear-streaked face buried in her mother's side. He had lost. His training, his aggression, his skill, none of it had been enough against superior numbers and tactics. He had failed. The thought was a familiar, bitter poison. But as Keen raised the pistol, aiming for the center of his chest, something shifted inside Jack. The physical battle was over. He had no more moves in that arena. But another battlefield was opening up. A fight not of bullets, but of words and will. He couldn't win with force. But he was a Navy SEAL. And when you're out of ammunition, you use your mind. He met Keen's cold gaze, and for the first time since the fight began, he felt a flicker of something other than despair. He had lost the battle. But the war had just begun. The muzzle of Keen's pistol was a cold, dark circle, an unblinking eye that promised a final, absolute end. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of spent cordite and the suffocating weight of inevitability. Jack was on his knees, a prisoner, but his mind was clear, racing through angles and possibilities. He had one weapon left. He met Keen's impassive gaze, not with a plea, but with a look of cold, calculated pity. "Before you do that," Jack said, his voice surprisingly calm and even, "you should probably consider the consequences of killing a United States Navy SEAL on approved leave." A flicker of something, perhaps annoyance, crossed Keen's face. "You're a long way from home, soldier. No one is coming to look for you." "That's where you're wrong," Jack said, selling the lie with every ounce of his training. "When I saw you on the ridge, I activated a subcutaneous emergency beacon. It's standard issue for Tier 1 operators. My vitals and location are being monitored in real time by a JSOC task force out of Fort Bragg. This cabin, this entire grid square, is a pre-registered emergency extraction point." He let the technical jargon settle in the quiet room. It was all a fabrication, but it was built on a foundation of truth that men like Keen would understand. Keen's expression didn't change, but a subtle tension appeared in his shoulders. He was a contractor, not a fool. He knew what JSOC was. A firefight with a lone man was a manageable risk. A battle with a helicopter full of Delta Force operators or Navy SEALs was a death sentence. "You're bluffing," Keen said. But the conviction in his voice had weakened by a fraction. "Maybe," Jack conceded, a small, mirthless smile touching his lips. "But my last biometric check-in was over an hour ago. Protocol for a missed check-in is the deployment of a quick reaction force. They don't call ahead, they just come. So the question you have to ask yourself, Keen, is, do you feel lucky? Because in about 30 minutes, this entire valley is going to be filled with men who make you and your wounded team look like amateur hikers." The seed of doubt was planted. Keen's eyes flickered toward his men, who were now looking at him with undisguised unease. This was no longer a simple asset retrieval. It had escalated into something far more dangerous. Just as Keen was processing this new, unacceptable variable, Clara spoke, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the tension. "His beacon is your immediate problem," she said, stepping forward slightly, placing herself between Keen and Lily. "But I'm your long-term one." Keen turned his cold gaze on her. "You have nothing, Ms. Evans." Clara stared back, her fear now completely replaced by a shell of ice-cold resolve. "The encrypted drive in my daughter's pack. You think it's just my leverage? It's not. It's a dead man's switch." She took a deliberate breath, her eyes locked on Keen's. "I retained a digital security firm in Geneva. If I don't log in with a biometric password every 24 hours, the entire contents of that drive are automatically released to a curated list of recipients: the FBI's Cybercrimes Division, the SEC, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. Harrison Vance won't just be investigated, he'll be front-page news on a global scale by sunrise tomorrow." This was the second blow, and it was a powerful one. Jack had created a tactical threat. Clara had just revealed a strategic one. Killing them now wouldn't just fail to solve the problem. It would be the very trigger that detonated the bomb. "You're both very good liars," Keen said. Though the professional calm in his voice was now frayed at the edges. "The data center fire at Vance's subsidiary in Virginia 3 months ago," Clara pressed on, ramming her advantage home, "the one the fire marshal ruled as faulty wiring. It wasn't. It was arson. Vance was trying to destroy the server farm where the original data was stored. But he was too late. I'd already copied everything." She had fabricated the detail on the spot, a plausible, specific event that added a thick layer of credibility to her story. It was a masterstroke. Keen was silent. The gears were turning in his head. Jack could almost see the calculations. His mission was to retrieve the child and contain the situation. But the situation was now completely out of control. Killing them guaranteed mission failure and the destruction of his employer. Taking them prisoner was now fraught with the risk of imminent military intervention. His simple, high-paying contract had devolved into a tactical and strategic nightmare. He was a well-paid contractor, not a loyal ideologue. His primary goal, above all else, was his own survival and the completion of his contract, not martyrdom for a corrupt billionaire. He glanced at his wounded men, then back at Jack and Clara. The power dynamic in the room had completely inverted. Though Jack was still on his knees with his hands bound, he and Clara were the ones in control. Finally, Keen lowered his pistol. He holstered the weapon with a decisive click. He looked at his two men. "Change of plan," he said, his voice clipped and all business again. "Forget the beacon. Forget the drive. The primary objective has been updated. Secure the assets and bring them in for debriefing. Both of them." He looked down at Jack, then at Clara. "Mr. Vance can sort this out himself." It was a victory, but a terrifying one. They had survived the immediate threat of execution, only to now face a far more dreadful fate of being delivered directly into the monster's hands. Keen's men moved with grim efficiency, one hauling Jack to his feet, while the other began to bind Clara's hands. The air was thick with the bitter taste of failure. They had won the psychological battle, only to lose the war, destined to be delivered into the hands of the very man they had fought so hard to escape. But as the zip tie was about to be cinched around Clara's wrists, Jack spoke, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "There's a third option, Keen." Keen, who had turned away, paused. He looked back at Jack, his expression a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. "I'm not interested in any more of your stories, soldier." "This isn't a story," Jack said, his eyes locked on the mercenary. "It's a business proposition, one where you and your men walk away clean with a full payout and zero risk of entanglement with JSOC or the FBI." He saw a flicker of interest in Keen's eyes. He was speaking the man's language now. Risk and reward. "You report back to Vance that the mission was successful, but complicated." Jack laid out the plan, his voice calm and logical. "You tell him there was a firefight. I was more than you bargained for. In the chaos, a lantern was knocked over. The cabin went up in flames. Fast. You tried to get them out, but it was too late. All three of us, me, Clara, and Lily, died in the fire, unidentifiable." Keen stared at him, saying nothing, his mind clearly parsing the proposal. One of his men grunted. "He's insane. Vance will want proof." "Proof of what?" Jack countered. "A pile of ashes. He'll send a team to verify. They'll find a burned-out cabin and some charred remains you can leave behind from your own supplies. Vance gets what he wants. Confirmation that the loose assets have been permanently dealt with. The threat of the data drive is gone forever. My JSOC beacon goes dark because I'm officially dead in a tragic accident. Everyone gets a clean slate." He paused, letting the logic sink in. "Your other option," Jack continued, pressing his advantage, "is to take us back to Philadelphia. You march us into Vance's office and hand him this whole mess. The seal, the beacon, the dead man's switch. You become part of the problem. And men like Harrison Vance are very good at eliminating problems. He won't protect you when the FBI comes knocking. He'll feed you to them to save himself. You know he will." Every word was true, and every man in the room knew it. They were paid contractors, loyal only to the money. They had no personal stake in Harrison Vance's twisted family drama. Jack had just offered them an exit strategy, a way to fulfill their contract while completely insulating themselves from all the dangerous complications. Clara, seeing the hesitation on Keen's face, played the final, decisive card. "To show you we're serious," she said, her voice steady. "I'll give you something, a single decryption key to one file on the drive. It contains proof of a minor insider trading deal Vance orchestrated last year. It's enough to prove the drive is real and that I have everything, but not enough to trigger a major investigation. It's your proof of a job well done. You can use it to ensure he never questions your story." It was the final piece, the offer of evidence. It was a brilliant move, transforming the bluff from a desperate gamble into a verifiable, mutually beneficial transaction. Keen was silent for a long moment, his cold eyes weighing the two futures before him. One was messy, unpredictable, and extremely dangerous. The other was clean, simple, and profitable. For a man like Keen, it wasn't a choice at all. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Stage it," he said to his men. "Make it look convincing." The tension in the cabin didn't so much break as it transformed. The open hostility was replaced by a strange, surreal sense of cooperation. Keen's men, now following a new set of orders, worked with Jack to make the scene plausible. They used an incendiary from their gear to start a controlled fire in one corner of the cabin, ensuring it would burn hot and fast. They left a few spent shell casings and a damaged ration pack to suggest a struggle and its aftermath. Clara, using the offline capabilities of the now dead satellite phone, transferred the single unlocked file to a data chip for Keen. 10 minutes later, it was done. The cabin was burning, thick black smoke pouring into the dawn sky. Keen stood at the edge of the clearing with Jack and Clara as his men prepared to leave. "If we see you again," he began. "You won't," Jack finished for him. Keen nodded once more, a look of what was almost professional respect in his eyes. Without another word, he and his team melted back into the forest, their forms disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. They were gone. For a long, stunned moment, Jack, Clara, and Lily stood in the clearing, watching the flames consume the small cabin that had been their prison and their refuge. Rocco nudged Jack's hand, whining softly. Lily, who had been silent through the entire ordeal, finally broke into shuddering sobs and buried her face in her mother's leg. Clara knelt and held her, tears of relief streaming down her own face. It was over. They were free. The days that followed were a quiet blur of healing. They returned to Jack's cabin, a true sanctuary now. Clara's health returned, and with it, the color in her cheeks and the light in her eyes. Lily slowly began to emerge from her shell. It started with a single word, then a sentence. She started playing with Rocco. Her laughter was a sound like the first rays of sun after a long storm. For Jack, the change was the most profound. The walls he had built around himself for years had been breached, not by force, but by the quiet, steady presence of this small, broken family. The silence in his cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft sounds of life. He found himself talking, smiling, feeling the sharp edges of his own grief begin to soften. On the fourth morning, as they stood on the porch watching the sun rise over the Pennsylvania hills, Clara asked the question that hung unspoken between them. What now? Jack looked at her, then at Lily, who was showing Rocco a seashell she had found. He thought of his empty past and looked at the new, unexpected future standing right in front of him. Now, he said, a genuine smile touching his eyes for the first time in years, we start over. Together. He had come to the edge of the world to lose himself. But instead, in the heart of the wilderness, alongside a woman of unbreakable courage and a child with the eyes of a survivor, he had finally found his way back. The war was over and a new dawn was just beginning.